What we've got up here for this session is a panel of some of my favorite SOC experts. And we're doing a panel, we call it Dispatch from the SOC. Being the blue team summon and all, I wanted to make sure we had just a conversation kind of back and forth with multiple points of view from multiple experts on what security operations centers are seeing across different, large and small businesses and everything in between. What do we need to pay the most attention to and things like that? And it's always good hearing from other people that are living this in various different kind of respects. So you all know me, I'm John. I'm gonna let everyone kind of go down the line and introduce themselves here. Go ahead.
Sure. I'm Brian Carroll, I'm Manager of Security Operations at Holman Automotive.
Hey, I'm Carson. There we are. Hey, I'm Carson Zimmerman. I work at Microsoft. I'm an investigations lead, focusing on M365 security.
Hi, everyone. Mark Orlando. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Bionic Cyber, and I'm also a certified instructor at SANS Institute.
All right. So thank you for joining me, everyone. I want to start off with kind of a broad question here. One of the things we're always talking about in classes and online and everything else is like there are certain priorities that a SOC has to pay attention to. So in 2022 in October, what are the things that come to mind when maybe you see the average SOC, whether it's a small or large organization, that maybe they're not spending enough time focusing on and things that could be super high impact that maybe the SOC should dedicate a little more resource, data sources to, or anything? Anything jump to mind for any of you? Someone to jump in first.
I don't know if this is, well, it's definitely not a SOC problem, but one of the things that I'm still seeing, I think we could easily have this conversation, like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but like just focusing on what you have, assets, what you actually have, what your infrastructure looks like, especially now that most organizations have undergone such dramatic change in the last couple of years. I find that that's one area where no matter what industry I'm in, no matter how mature the organization is, like security-wise, consistently a problem that I'm still seeing, like major gaps in our understanding of what assets we have and what the environment looks like.
I was actually going to say something pretty similar. The twist I would add is the SOC really needs to focus not just on its asset story. And in 10 years ago, we probably could have gotten away with saying, well, we're going to track everything with an IP address. Well, we can't really say that anymore, right? Because of all the cloud stuff flying around. So my twist would be, it needs to be focusing on what are the IT, OT, cloud, blah, 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 growth areas, and going after that from an asset perspective, a detection perspective, a coverage perspective. And like, they need to have someone who's like focused on that problem inside the SOC and or inside the cybersecurity apparatus that they're partnering with.
So is that something you see in, like, I'm totally assuming here, but you probably have visibility to a number of different profiles of organizations in terms of the problems that you help people deal with or see or whatever with Microsoft's, grand monster amount of data. Is there something like a difference between like a small organization versus a large organization with that particular recommendation?
It's going to be different variations in part on shadow IT. Right. And the problem, of course, is scale. And this can go so many ways. It's like, how many, because I work at Microsoft, I'm going to talk about Azure for a second. Like, how many different dozens or hundreds of Azure resource types are you running? And what's your logging and detection story for each of them, and like getting that nailed down, then repeat that. So for smaller organizations, or any organization, it's trying to set up boundaries around, all right, what's the expected footprint? Like just saying, hey, we're going to sanction these cloud providers, right? Like in the olden days, remember with Wi-Fi, back when we were all like, yeah, Wi-Fi, that's not happening, right? You were there too, I know. And everyone was like, hey, if you don't set up secure wireless, your users will for you. And theirs won't be as secure as yours, right? It's the same deal.
We're dealing with that a lot in a smaller business. My company is only 7,000 people. We're not the size of Microsoft or anything, but we have a lot of shadow IT going on and not a lot of pre-approved applications, and getting that inventory and tracking them down is really important because analysts see a different thing pop up every day and they don't know how to handle it. We don't have that list to go back to say, yeah, this is legit, should be here. No, this is something that somebody did, out of scope.
So how do we best approach a problem like that? Is that a case of the SOC needs new tools, or we have to use the same tools in better ways? If we have shadow IT, like what are our core resources? What are our kind of processes behind making sure we actually have all of that stuff? Anyone have an approach they like to follow there?
I'm a big fan of just blocking it, but you have to just stop. I don't know.
But you got to know it's there to block it,
Yeah.
right?
So we look at our proxy logs a lot. We look at the apps that people are going to, and then we take it back to executive leadership and say, hey, you want to use this? You have to have a business case. You got to go out and buy the licensing for it. You can't just do this one-off thing. You have this amount of time to fix it. We're gonna block it, right? Like we're done. We're done messing around with this. We're just gonna stop you. Right.
I mean, zero trust is going to be part of it. Sorry, buzzword. Put that on your bingo checklist sheet there, folks. But it's true, right? So think about where you're allowing authentication from, and the attestation and some of those pieces. Because in some ways, yeah, you're gonna have a segment of your organization go off and focus on asset inventory, as you should. But you've also got to bring those mechanisms in.
So with these kind of problems, there's certain tools and technologies that are emerging for this sort of thing. I think I just saw, I'm totally blanking on the name, but it was a Microsoft thing they just announced, I think back in August, where they're going to scan from the external internet to try to find unauthorized assets and other things, partially solving the shadow IT problem. Do you know the name of the thing I'm talking about, or what it is that I'm referring to? I wish I remembered the name. Anyway, there's a vendor solution for that problem now, right? From Microsoft. But there's other tools and data that are changing, right? Compared to what we had in the past, now that we have so much of everything going into the cloud. Is there any change, what would you say are going to be data sources and things we need to pay attention to that are more important going forward? And what are we going to maybe see less of or put less emphasis on in terms of detecting actual attacks? Any opinions on that?
I think there's the question of what we think we'll see and what we would really love to see. Probably two different answers. I don't know. I definitely see that. To me, anyway, it seems like in the last couple of years, maybe the last decade, even, the SOC has been kind of a go-to to solve IT governance problems, like IT asset management. It's well, SOC needs to know everything that's in the environment. So congratulations, you own all that now. You got to tell us what we have. And so, to Carson's point, I think zero trust. I think going in that direction where these things stop being situations where we have to buy another tool for attack surface management. And it's more no, we just need to, get to a place where we're not trying to track down a rogue IP address or a new asset. This is just not going to be scalable anymore. And it's certainly not going to be something that the SOC can handle. So I guess that's a long way of saying, I think we're going to see a lot of these IT governance issues, right now, it's a really interesting problem to solve for security. It's now attack surface management. I think at some point the stuff is going to swing back the other way, and it's going to be nope, this is an IT management, an IT governance problem. It's not something that the SOC can do in addition to all the other things it's doing.
I have a different bent. So I have this colorful history with network telemetry, right? And there was a time and place where I was yeah, you need all of the Zeek everywhere. Now, do I think Zeek is still cool? Yeah. Do I think Suricata is still cool? Yeah. There was a time when people would say PCAP or it didn't happen, right? And the thing of it is now is yeah, we have EDR and XDR and we have all the cloud logs. And if there was any logs, I would tell you to go collect more of. It's your cloud logs. And see also Don's talk from earlier, really good stuff there. The thing of it is that, all right, you take that to extreme. Then you say to somebody, we're just going to stop collecting network telemetry altogether. And I'm well, I don't really feel good about that either. So then the question is okay, so now you're collecting the NetFlow and the SuperFlow and the IDS alerts and then all this other stuff. Do you really have the budget for that? And it's really, really tough to fully abandon some of those telemetry sources that 10 years ago were your meat and potatoes.
Is there anything network-wise that if a company was you have X amount of dollars, what data source from a network perspective would you aim for? Because by the way, the next question I'm going to ask is, well, how do we deal with the encryption problem, right? Showing up on this, but any kind of thought from really any of you on that sort of thing? Like, where do we start?
I feel like NetFlow is kind of the go-to, right? It's who's talking to who and what language they're speaking, but not exactly what they're saying. But should this machine talk to this machine? Has it done that historically? Is that new traffic? Right? It's really good insight to what your network topology looks like at a pretty good level.
I'm a big fan of that one because of like, lateral movement, right? Like that's a thing that even if you're not decrypting it, just seeing two things have talked that don't normally talk. And people are like, well, how do I know what normally talks? Like you collect the net flow and you look at what has talked in the past, right? I say that over and over in class. Is like, if you have been collecting the data, then you have the records in theory to tell you what should be happening in these two kind of areas, and encryption or not, right? That can still point out, it's like, oh, SMB traffic, right? That's weird.
Yeah, can I get a show of hands really quick? Everybody here who is in like the operations sort of realm, at, adjacent to security monitoring or responsible for security monitoring, how many of you are still really focused on network telemetry?
For those of you online, there was one hand.
What about endpoint?
That brave soul.
Yeah, endpoint. Okay,
It's like half the room.
Is the reason, I guess I can't really easily ask the audience, but by show of no or yes, is encryption part of the reason that you're not paying as much attention to network? No's? No? Okay. So, quick shout out. What is the reason? Vendors. What else we got? What was that? 100% remote. So maybe you don't have access to that kind of thing, or you don't really have a network to monitor, right? Yeah. Anything else? Where does the network end? Right? Interesting question. Yeah. EDR is good enough.
So like I've heard people for NetFlow say, we've got to get NetFlow all the way down to the top of rack switches. And I'm like, what year is it? And do you really? Like for reals? You've got to go back to some of the stuff that Ingrid talked about. Is you've got finite resources here, right? How far you want to go with this? If you're talking about collecting NetFlow, at least start with what your firewalls can generate, so long as you're not melting A, the firewall, and B, the syslog receiver on the other end.
So with the encryption issue, how big of a problem in your all experience is that? How big of a factor is that in getting in the way of making network data usable? I know, from my own experience, when I teach class, I always ask people like, are you decrypting TLS? Are you considering DOH? Is that a problem for you? Do you not care? Is this irrelevant because you're all remote, right? Any thoughts on the tooling support and the kind of hidden data aspect of now everything going into TLS 1.3 and DOH and all that kind of stuff?
I mean, I'm working with teams that have, all the resources in the world to get as much decryption as they want to get as many tools as they want to. But at the end of the day, it ends up being more of an architecture question. It's like, well, if I'm talking about network telemetry, like what even is the network? Like, is it somebody sitting at home, like using my cloud services? Like, how am I going to monitor that? So that's more of what I see than an encryption hurdle.
Plus one.
We've had to re-architect entire applications just to get inbound decryptions. Like the devs for you over the years were like, yeah, let's just put it directly exposed to the internet. Now it's got to go through the F5 and go through offload balance, SSL offloading, and come back, and they weren't ready for that change. So there's other supplementary data we can look at to get the detections without decrypting as well.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting future for that kind of stuff. Shifting gears here. So in your keynote, Ingrid had mentioned you don't have to do everything to be a world-class SOC. You have to be a SOC that does the things you are chartered to do well. How does an organization approach deciding what those core things a SOC should do? How do they figure out the answer to that question? And this is a question to everyone, not just Carson. Where, if you're building a SOC for the first time, if you're a small organization, like where should the SOC start?
I can give you a couple answers, but I'm not going to steal all of them. I'm actually going to steal a page from the book of Chris Crowley and say you should have a steerco. That's a set of individuals, usually business stakeholders, that are part of the SOC foundation, usually include a member or two from the SOC, to have those exact conversations. So that's part of my meta answer. and from that should come conversations like, we really need to do this, really need to do that. One of the ways I like to force clarity around this exact question at any given period of time, and frankly, at different levels of abstraction, is having a stack ranked priority list of the asks that you are receiving the SOC from your business partners, because people come in, their hair is going to be on fire. They're like, we have a new thing, we have a new project, we need your help. And we're like, cool. Where in the stack rank list would you like that to be? And what's not going to get done as a result? If you can drive that kind of clarity, you'll be better for it.
Yeah, I like that approach, kind of going to your stakeholders and saying like, hey, you tell me, right? Because I am your service, right? Trying to protect your assets and keep your business running and keep everything up to date around here. Any other thoughts on that?
I was just going to ask how you're getting your stakeholders at the table in the first place. I have hard enough time doing that. You're very lucky.
Candy. Yeah, that can definitely be a tough thing. In terms of the attacks that we're seeing, maybe Brian, this is a good question for you. Any unique problems that you've seen show up with more frequency in 2022 that you're like starting to focus more time on, whether it's phishing or really anything else?
Yeah, we get a lot of like partner compromise. So we have small dealerships that we deal with on a daily basis where we buy vehicles and sell them vehicles, and attackers will get into their email because they're less secure than us, and they'll get in the middle of those transactions and try and send the payments for the vehicles to some other account. So it's the bank fraud, it's the routing fraud and all that kind of stuff. And then we have some web applications that they try to get into as well, because we back bill repair costs and all sorts of that kind of stuff. Phishing's up, business email compromise from a small medium business perspective. That's kind of the status quo for us.
Yeah, that's a really big one. Show of hands here. Who has seen or an attempt at a business email compromise like situation in their organization? It's probably going to be every single hand in here. Yeah, for those online,
that's pretty much the whole.
Pretty much every hand, right? Huge problem. How do you attack that?
A lot of training for our end users and a lot of process. So our financial side of the business has a process they have to follow with checks and balances before they can change anything. And it's really relying on the human element, not the technical element. There are tools that can help you with the technical element, but they're not sure-proof, right?
So I'll actually share one very specific technique. So I refinanced my house not long ago, and the bank was like, hey, call us before you wire any money anywhere, just to confirm the routing and account numbers. And I'm like, oh, I know exactly why they're doing that. That's my day job. Good times. I was totally going to say BEC. I would also say cloud more generally. Your cloud resources are a highly valuable asset to the adversary. If they can compromise your users, or so help me, your admins, and then thus gain the ability to use your cloud resources to achieve whatever goals they're trying to do. It's usually financial by volume anyways, it's financial. Make sure that you're looking at your cloud resources and you're not having dollar leaks or euro leaks or wherever your geo might be. Make sure that the adversary is not in your cloud resources, using your resources to their benefit.
So to pick that a little bit further, how are they turning access to cloud resources into a financial attack? Is this a financial gain based on ransoming the company for the data that they got access to, or is it turning around and using that to attack someone else, or what are you seeing?
Use your imagination.
All the above.
It's all that above, right? So what are you going to do when you have access to someone's cloud provider resources? I'm not picking on any particular cloud company. I'm just saying, what are you going to do as an adversary when you have access to a blank check and some cloud resources? Anybody? Crypto mining, boom, right? Use your imagination.
So how do we most easily detect that someone has done that sort of a thing or is approaching success in that kind of an attack? I mean, obviously monitoring of certain things, but like if someone's crypto mining on our cloud assets right now, is that looking at like a Azure monitor and saying like, oh, why is the CPU always at 100%? Is it as simple as that, or are there more kind of tactical ways of doing it?
There's all kinds of things you can do, and it's not just security, it's billing, right? What does your cloud bill look like this month versus last, right? A good cloud provider should provide you the capability to get an email alert when it sees a major delta in your bill one month over the next. And it's not just a one person over in accounting, it's to your engineers, right? Your engineers should be getting those notices as well.
You can also whitelist what type of resources your IT team is allowed to provision up there, and then alert on things that are out of that scope. Like, oh, we can't turn up GPU resources, but all of a sudden one just appeared. That's weird.
Totally.
Any thoughts on ransomware tactics or anything really in that realm? Because that's the other thing that always pops up when we're talking high impact attacks. Like people immediately jump to BC and ransomware. Any trends that you've seen or good advice that you could hand out on getting in the way of that, detecting it early, right? Like any of that kind of stuff.
I mean, I think there's like convergence now of ransomware and really like any sophisticated like multi-stage attack. Like a lot of, if you can reliably detect precursors to a lot of ransomware, you can reliably detect a whole bunch of different stuff, not just ransomware. And I think, in a lot of, not in all cases, but in a lot of these cases, ransomware just happens to be the thing that gets deployed, but it could easily be something else, right? So I think having like detection, in depth, giving yourself as many different opportunities as you can to identify attacks like early stage, like late stage is really key. I know working with clients where we're working on like ransomware playbooks, it's like the first umpteen steps of the ransomware playbook looks really, really similar to the first several steps of, detecting any other attack, malware, stuff like that.
I'm going to take this moment and I'm going to use another buzzword. I'm going to say you should go look at attack, the attack framework, not just for your on-prem stuff, which you're probably already thinking of, but cloud as well, to exactly your point.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was going to go with this is, you had mentioned kind of during your presentation, like SOPs need to be constantly updated and playbooks and all that kind of stuff. They need to be living documents. An organization that wants to stop ransomware and BEC and everything has to understand how it works, make the playbooks, and hopefully have that whole thing kind of work like clockwork. Is there any specific tactics that a SOC can use to like make this might be ransomware coming our way style playbook? Like detect that as early up the chain as possible.
Oh, make that do a TTX. Do that you want to pick like, and when I think tabletop exercises for your executives and that involve the nerds in the room, I'm a nerd. That's definitely on my top 10 list because it gets people at all different layers involved.
Gotcha. And so do you know any good resources for like coming up with tabletops? Is there any like pre-made set that has something, because people haven't done it before, right? Like they can kind of fumble their way through it, but do you know of any good solid resources that can help people do that kind of thing?
We spent like 3 pages on it in second edition.
Perfect. So there you go. Download the book, right? Back to like playbooks in general, if you're looking at a SOC versus like the one that's really good at writing playbooks, what does that look like as opposed to one that is maybe failing at doing that right? Like how would you describe the difference between good and bad playbooks? What's a good playbook look like?
One that gets used more than one time after it gets written. So seen a lot of playbooks get written and they're awesome. And they're like the most detailed, prescriptive, well laid out documents. They get written, maybe they get used in a tabletop exercise, or they get used like one time, the first time that thing happens. And then they go on a share or wherever documents live. No one ever looks at them again, ever. And because no, I know what it says. It's fine. Like I'll just go do it. Right. So the best playbooks I would say are ones that actually get used. And usually that means it's not actually in a document, but it's built into your tool set. I don't care if that's like a template in your incident management system that has like steps prescribed, or if it's like a SOAR playbook where things are happening automatically or some combination. That's like my biggest thing when it comes to playbooks is it can't just be a document that you wrote. It might be a fantastic document, but no one's going to pull up that document and read it when they're doing an investigation or have an incident.
Most good playbooks I look at are actually not that long. And I get really worried when someone writes a playbook that's more than about 5 pages, because it means a couple things. One of them is A, that's going to make it harder to read and harder to follow. And the second is what playbooks did they not write when they were writing the really long one? I like having a template. One of the things to think about is your playbooks could also be your Jupyter notebooks. Ooh, think about that one for a second.
was actually thinking about this earlier today. It's like, I wish every sim had Jupyter built into it. So that when an alert fired off, you could just go and follow that playbook.
Is anyone doing that right now? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or so? Nice. So yeah, that's one thing that I try to bring up in class, and glad you mentioned that sort of thing. I think that is kind of a future direction for this sort of thing, especially when you see the convergence of machine learning and AI and how all of that's already done with playbooks. I can see a future where it's like, here's the playbook with the actionable kind of buttons you can press. It pulls the data, cuts it all up. You don't need to know how to do the AI part, but it can draw a picture for you, and then it can maybe have the instructions on, oh, if it looks like this, do this. If it looks like that, maybe it's not a problem. Actionable kind of work getting put in with the instructions themselves, I think, is a really exciting opportunity. And I haven't seen it done beyond actually using Jupyter notebooks, but I'm wondering if a platform will emerge that kind of does that sort of thing. Idea for anyone, right? Free idea. Anyone wants to start a business. Yeah, really cool stuff. Security Onion has something kind of like that. They have their I think it's called Playbook web application. I'm totally blanking on the name right now, but they have Sigma rules on the same page as where the playbook can be, and you can change the rule and deploy it and all that just from one thing, which I think is a really nice workflow for things showing up when you're trying to do that kind of thing. Switching gears to a different topic that I wanted to hit while we're up here. Metrics, right? Always the eternal question. As a SOC trying to figure out, am I doing a good enough job? Where do you even start with that? Am I doing the right thing? Is that purely measured by, am I doing what the stakeholders asked me to do? Because maybe they don't know what to ask for, right? So that probably doesn't cover all of it, but how do you approach that?
And we have the traditional metrics of time to detect, time to respond, but that's not enough to go by. You got to look at how often are your analysts asking each other for additional information, right? Do they have the data they need at their fingertips? Or they have to go out and find it? Is your senior staff doing more of the stuff that a junior staff might need to be doing? So they're not focusing on moving the security program forward. Those kind of people metrics, I think, are really good for assessing how well your SOC is operating as a group.
So optimizing and answering the question, are we using people's capabilities to the best of our ability to use that kind of stuff?
Yep.
Yeah.
Are they tasked where they need to be?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say that's absolutely a great mark of a good SOC, is we're using what we can do in the right way. Plenty of other directions we can go with that though too. What else comes to mind?
I could spend a long time talking about metrics. I have very complicated feelings about metrics. I have two thoughts I'll share right now. One of them is always be careful about how far you're driving any of your time to metrics, right? You want to be driving the mean time to detect and mean time to investigate and all that stuff down, but only to a point. And you want to think about parsing that out, pun intended, by incident type, because it's going to be very different for certain different incident types. And some of those incident types might be pretty rare. So you want to be really cautious about over-indexing on that, because you're going to turn some of your analysts into alert smashers, and you don't want that. The other thing I think about when I think about metrics is not pushing it necessarily towards an SLO, but looking at a trend over time. And we could all probably have a very long religious debate on the stage right now, if we really wanted to, about okay, so your number of incidents is going up or down. Is that good or bad?
I got alertsmashers.com, so nobody else take that. I'm gonna register that as soon as I step off the stage. That's mine, so everyone knows. Yeah, I actually, I think it was a quote by you, John, which I usually butcher quotes when I'm repeating them that you said, but I think it was along the lines of not every metric should be driven to 100 or 0.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah, which I think is, kind of Carson, what you're saying. I think there's so much truth in that. I think there's a really good book actually called The Tyranny of Metrics, and it talks about kind of using anecdotes and case studies from all different sectors and areas, ways in which metrics fails when you use them the wrong way. Specifically, if you use them as a financial incentive of some sort, or use them to penalize. And I think that's where you kind of get into trouble, where you're driving things a little bit too far. So I think it's, when you're talking about security metrics, you have to have not only the measure, like we talk about in class, right? Not only the measure, but a target value, like what is good in this case. And it may not be like the best thing you can imagine. It may just be what's realistic for us, right now. And that's, one tool in your management toolbox. It's not a substitute for domain expertise or, management. It is just another thing another data point or set of data points.
Yeah, sticking to quotes from other people on the panel, I think Carson was the person that said back, I think it was 2017 SOC Summit, metrics are like lightsabers. I think that was your quote.
Oh, it was. Yes, I remember that now. Thank you.
Can be used for good or evil, right?
Yeah, some hashtag too soon screenshots there. I would one thing I'll add on there is don't drive any metric to an extreme. Chances are if you get to a point where like you might have a gut feeling where you're like, wow, I think we're doing pretty good on this. Like that might be a time for you to pivot. And I'm going to pick coverage is one area. If you've got coverage, don't push your monitoring coverage to 99.9%. It's not happening for two reasons. Number one, shadow IT. And number two, you should really be thinking instead about the breadth of that coverage. How deep are you going into the kill chain and the attack framework? Think about that as well.
Yeah, that kind of brings up in my mind some of the other things I like to talk about with metrics is like what we're trying to hit is good enough, right? No one can hit perfection. If you read a lot of the Google literature on the whole SRE stuff, right? Like there's a lot of really inspiring stuff in there that a lot of people are pulling thoughts and what we should probably do in security and next from. And in one of those chapters in the Google SRE book, they say like, most things should not be 100%, right? It becomes cost prohibitive, you waste time. And so have you really thought about like for your SOC, what is good enough security, right? It makes my stakeholders happy. We didn't have a ransomware event this year, even though we had smaller problems. Like, can you draw a line for what is going to make what we're trying to hit here happen without spending too much, without going crazy? Because, sometimes you don't need a Ferrari. You just need the Toyota to get you back and forth from the grocery store, right? And that gets the job done. Right now, of course, we all want to be perfect and things can be very expensive and it's a loose comparison there. But that's one of the things I always look for in metrics and talk to teams about is like, have you thought about what you really need to hit here to kind of keep it within normal range? That's an interesting discussion to have. You brought up earlier, one of the other things that was kind of in those books in the keynote, bringing more development and kind of engineering into the SOC. And that's another thing that's constantly showing up, right? We need to spend less time reacting and more time proactively getting automation and other stuff kind of happening. How do we look to balance, I will say, operational work versus development and engineering for the SOC? What kind of time split should we be looking for? Or is there a way that you would pick that for any given team?
That's going to be heavily dependent upon your capacity. But one of the things I would challenge a lot of people to think about is your capacity is more under your control than you might feel like day to day. And trust me, I've had my low points where I'd be like, man, we're so overwhelmed. Like we're not getting out of this. Like there's too many incident comings. We're totally buried. I don't, it's you go to the dark place, right? We all have in working in SOCs at some point. I would challenge you to routinely think about what feels pointless and how do we stop doing that? And how do we level set those expectations with our stakeholders? And you know what? We're doing forensics on crypto mining and our cloud stuff 5 times a month. Why the heck are we doing this and can we stop? Because maybe I'm going to get a quarter of a person back. So whenever I talk about making time for that, my mind goes there. I like to split it, and your split could be a quarter, a third, a half of your time, maybe even more. But people have got to be in it with enough frequency that they don't forget all those beautiful SOPs that we were talking about earlier. You don't want someone who's on call looking at alerts just 1 week out of a quarter. That's probably too far in the opposite extreme.
How would we measure if we've gone too far in one of those directions? Because I think we're all on board with like, yeah, automation is good and we want more automation, but it's a risk of like, are we doing too much and are we dropping the ball on those alerts? What would be the signs that might pop up that would indicate like, oh, we went too far?
Not following the SOPs or taking too long to investigate something that should have been pretty quick, pretty crisp. One of the things that people have cautioned me about not too long ago actually is when we have that DevOps mindset And we indeed have people who are both responsible for, detection, creation, and analysis, or, data curation and investigation, just as two possibilities. We need to be very careful about burnout. It's very possible and in fact, very likely that some of those people will spend all 40 hours in the week doing their day job. And then the only time they feel like they can get ahead of the game is that extra 10 or 20 hours a week. And then you've got someone working 60 hours a week, and that's no good.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I had already written down, like, I want to talk about burnout at some point. When we're working in a SOC with repetitive workflows, things that can be high stress and all of that, what are your kind of individual approaches for watching for burnout? What are the signs that like someone has gone too far, and how do you jump at correcting that before it gets to the point where they're like, I'm just going to leave, this is too much?
I mean, it's, I think there's a lot there, like a lot of different, answers to that. But, I think it goes without saying, probably you have to like really pay attention to the quality and quantity of the work being produced by each individual person. And, kind of getting back to what we were talking about earlier with like metrics and like teamwork metrics, it's like, I've seen a lot of managers, maybe I've even been that manager at certain points, where it's like the work's getting done. So like, I'm not going to ask too many questions or dig too deep. If it's just one person doing 90% of the work, well, I guess that's just how things are getting done. So I think, the first thing is you have to get transparency. You have to know kind of like how the work is being shared. But then I think as long as you're paying attention, there should be telltale signs that, someone is not producing the quality of work that you would expect, or someone's, missing deadlines, or, other kind of behavioral indicators that may or may not be showing up in the work product. But I think, you have to have the transparency first and foremost. You have to have that, like, be having those one-on-ones, having those like regular check-ins. That's another like really important thing, having that communication channel open. Those are, I think, my big ones.
Yeah, I was gonna say it has to go both ways. As a SOC analyst, you can't be afraid to tell your manager like, hey, I can't look at another alert today. I'm gonna, fall over in my chair. I'm dead, right? Get your team to rotate responsibilities and things like that, so they're not constantly doing the same thing over and over again. The one-on-ones are really good, and just having that open channel of communication, like you said, goes both directions. I'm gonna ask you a question. What can I do for you? How are you feeling? Like, are you burned out? Like, I'll ask these questions, but you have to give me positive feedback back, right?
I'll mention two things here. One of them is establishing team norms around high severity incidents and handling those. For example, you can establish a team norm. Hey, if you worked over the weekend and it goes past end days, there is a rotation. I don't care whether you're crispy or not, you're getting rotated out because we care about you. But I definitely think it goes to that understanding. So like, who watches Ted Lasso, right? I don't work for Apple, but who watches for Ted Lasso, right? A bunch of us, right? One of the reasons why I love that show is it shows a workplace relationship between people where they're emotionally available for one another, right? And that's the kind of camaraderie we especially want in the SOC, where you feel comfortable and safe going to your buddy, right, who and are like, hey, you're crispy, like, can I help you? That kind of relationship.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Ted Lasso is a great show. If those of you out there haven't seen it, definitely go check that one out. How would you measure the quality of work that someone's outputting to kind of pick up, maybe if they don't tell you this sort of thing? Because obviously there's some pressure there. Like if you're not working in a SOC like that, people might be like, oh, it's great. Like you don't want to tell your boss, like I'm overwhelmed, it's too much, because you might be scared of a host of things, right? How might you otherwise pick that up? Like, are you doing kind of measurements on the work in some specific way, or what signs in the work product, I guess, might show up?
Are we going back to metrics then? Because
yeah, a little bit.
You got
might be.
You got the alert smasher, right? If this individual's closing out alerts constantly and they're all really quick to resolve, but it's a complex issue that shouldn't be that quickly resolved, you probably have somebody that's just kind of lost interest in doing all the right work, right?
I would definitely go for unforced errors. In any incident that is high severity, several days or weeks, high emotions, lots of stakeholders, et cetera. It's pretty rare for just one person to be investigating that. So one of the ways that the team members can show up for each other as allies is to look at the unforced errors being committed by the other people looking at the same analytic product, and then being there for each other. And sometimes you say that to your peer, sometimes that you say that to your management, sometimes you do both.
Yeah, and as John well knows, in Management 551, we talk about this, right? This concept of doing like quality reviews of your investigations. So if you're not doing spot checks, if you're in any kind of lead position, and I would say, actually, talked about this with some students not too long ago, it's a great rotating responsibility to be like, you're on quality checks for this week. So here's the process, here's the checklist we use. We're looking for analytic completeness, make sure you follow the process. We're looking for unforced errors or just kind of sloppy analysis or whatever it is. That's a responsibility that you should, if you've got a solid process, be able to kind of rotate and then have, regular feedback to people that say here's where the kind of bar is for quality. Here's where specifically where you kind of fell short this week. Let's talk about that. Let's, revisit that. But I especially like the idea of having that be like a rotating thing and not just like a manager to analyst kind of conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, I always ask that kind of stuff because as the people that work with me in the back of the room know, I'm always asking okay, we can make a change and that change may be better, it may be worse, but what are we going to see in terms of a number, something objective? How do we know that thing is actually better or worse or happening or not happening? And so I always like to try to bring it down to what is the thing we're going to look at to know whether this is occurring or not? Because if there's no, if you can't tell if something's happening in any way at all, is it really happening, right? So there's always a measurement. You just got to figure out, kind of explore what that thing is and digging into some of those things, especially when it gets into mushier, kind of higher level generic or burnout stuff. I think it's a little bit difficult to come up with metrics for that. So good to hear your opinions on that. Final topic, which we only got 2 minutes left. I don't know if we can cover this in 2 minutes. Real quick, rapid fire round. Threat intelligence. What are we looking for when we say actionable threat intelligence? What does that mean to you? SOC that has someone with a good level of threat intelligence versus one that doesn't, what does that look like?
I can speak to the one that doesn't have the good threat intelligence. We have our vendor specific threat intelligence, but we don't have external sources that we're relying on that are massaged and that kind of stuff. And it does hurt us from time to time where we don't have the correct information about a source IP or what campaigns it's a part of. And it's hard to get the full picture on an alert or an incident in that case. So get your threat intelligence.
Yeah, it has to lead to a decision, action, priority, something. If it's just that's really interesting to know, then to me that's far less useful. I won't say worthless, but far less useful.
Any thoughts on that, Carson?
I agree. We talked about this. I'll never forget the time Catherine and I were actually unpacking this very issue in strategy 6. And I don't know who came up with it first. I was like, it's a Venn diagram. Right. And it's that inner join of those 3 circles. And I'm going to mess one of these up. It's got to be relevant to you and you've got to be able to do something with it. And I forgot the third. So Catherine's probably online right now being like, Carson, you blew it.
You'll see it in the Slack channel in a minute.
There you go.
I knew it. Yeah. My take on this sort of thing, and I bring this up because when I teach, I always ask, how many people have a threat intelligence platform, a dedicated one? Show of hands. How many people have a dedicated threat intelligence platform right now? Not many, right? So that means it feels like to me, unless you're doing something else that I'm not asking about, that there is a sore lacking of relevant, actionable threat intelligence out there in the world. And, hopefully inspire people to say oh yeah, we should probably get one of those, right? Whether it's something free or otherwise. To me, the difference between good and bad threat intelligence is that alert that goes off, someone said this IP is bad. What happens next? If it's a full exploratory, well, what could it be? What might it have been? What was it 5 years ago versus oh, it was tied to this campaign at this date. This is how it was used. This was the backdoor it represented. How quickly you can move from I have no idea, but supposedly it's bad to it's definitely or it's not. That's to me that measurable. Do we have good threat intelligence or not?
I'll mention one thing quick there is one of the litmus tests I like to use around do you really need a tip is, are you consuming, deduplicating, merging, and matching on IOCs against your data? Or are you trying to foster a rich, colorful conversation between your analysts around Intel, including Intel that is bespoke and came from you? Because if it's the former, maybe you don't need one. If it's the latter, you need one.
Yeah, and you definitely want to be collecting and using that threat intelligence that came from you, right? Because that's as good as it gets. All right, I think we've run out of time here. So thank you everyone for hanging out with us and hearing our back and forth on this. If you have any questions, of course, social hour, right? We'd love to continue to talk about these things. It's what we do for a job. So good times to be had by all later on for that one.